We see death coming into our midst like black smoke, a plague which cuts off the young, a rootless phantom which has no mercy for fair countenance. Woe is me of the shilling of the armpit. It is of the form of an apple, like the head of an onion, a small boil that spares no one. Great is its seething like a burning cinder, a grievous thing of ashy color. They are similar to the seeds of the black peas, broken fragments of brittle sea coal, cinders of the peeling of the cockleweed, a mixed multitude, a black plague like halfpence, like berries. These were the words of the Italian writer Boccaccio in the preface to his 1358 Decameron, describing what he saw firsthand during the days of the Black Plague. Up to 75% of those who showed these symptoms were dead within 72 hours. And the Christian church was in the thick of it. There were heroes, there were cowards, but in the end, they were all changed forever. In the middle of the 14th century, the world as Europeans knew it began to collapse. Not from war, not from famine alone, although there were a lot of those, but from an invisible enemy that moved faster than armies and struck without warning. Within a few years, it would kill tens of millions. It would empty towns, shatter families, and leave the living wondering whether God himself had turned away. And at the center of this brutal catastrophe stood the most powerful group of people in Western Europe, the Christian church. On the eve of the Black Plague, Europe was deeply, overwhelmingly Christian. Church shaped nearly every part of life from birth to death, from law to morality, from the rhythms of work to the meaning of suffering itself. It was all defined by the church. Most people believed that God governed the world directly, every aspect of it. Illness was never random. Disaster was never an accident. Everything had a deep spiritual meaning. Priests heard confessions, bishops oversaw entire cities. The church was deeply involved in politics. Monasteries cared for the poor. When people feared death, they turned to the church, not as some abstract institution, but as a daily presence that walked and moved and lived among them, and gave them advice on the deepest issues of life. No one could imagine that this system, so deeply embedded in society, was about to be tested in ways that it had never faced before, and never be the same. The Black Plague likely arrived in Europe in 1347, carried along trade routes from Asia. Specifically, it was noted that there were 12 particular ships that entered Mediterranean ports. They were already filled with dead and dying people. Those sailors who had survived stumbled off into the cities, carrying with them this brutal, merciless disease. Within days, within months, whole cities were completely infected, dropping like flies. The symptoms were truly horrifying. Most died within 3 days, some within just a few hours. The doctors were powerless. They tried every kind of treatment that they knew of back in those days. They attempted bloodletting, they tried herbal poultices and different astrological wizardry, and none of it worked. Entire households vanished almost overnight. A contemporary Florentine writer who I've mentioned earlier, Giovanni Boccaccio, described how terror dissolved normal human bonds. He said, brother forsook brother, uncle, nephew, sister, brother, and often wife, husband. Nay, what is more and almost incredible, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children. That's from his book called The Decameron, written in 1353. Death was everywhere, and meaning as to why was desperately sought by everyone. Without the modern medicine that we have today, people had no choice but to see this plague through the lens of theology, through the lens of the church. Many believed that this was divine punishment. Sermons urged repentance, believing that perhaps if people would repent, this whole plague would go away. Chroniclers record that people were searching desperately in their lives for some kind of sin that might have provoked God's wrath. Was it greed? Was it pride? Was it sexual immorality? Was it just neglecting the poor? And the church responded in the language that it knew best. There were calls for public prayer, for large mass fasting, for confessions, for penitential processions, and bells continued to ring constantly for the dead. At first, it almost looked like a revival. Masses were multiplying. People were flowing to the churches, trying to seek God, but as they did this, the cemeteries still overflowed. In city after city, the clergy encouraged the faithful believers to turn back to God because they believed that repentance was the only thing that might be able to persuade him to lift this plague. And yet here was a tragic irony. These very practices that were meant to save souls, large gatherings coming together in close contact, doing these communal rituals, actually helped to spread this disease. As fear spread, many people fled their homes. Many abandoned their own family members, as we saw earlier. Some locked the sick inside houses and just left them to die. But many men and women of God did not flee. Priests were expected to hear last confessions and administer final rites and bury the dead, because back then they believed that if the confession was not given, the person would not be allowed to enter into heaven. In some regions, 1/3 to 1/2 of the parish priests died within the first year. And in other places, over the course of 5 years, which is how long the first wave of the Black Plague lasted, there were none left by the end of it. These places were left without a priest at all. A collection of contemporary accounts preserved in medieval source books describes churches left empty and desperate communities begging for anyone who could perform the sacraments. The bishops responded in the only way that they could, which was lowering the standards for ordination. Teenagers were ordained. Men with little training, almost sometimes no training at all, were rushed forward through the whole process in order to be able to serve. The church was bleeding, literally and as an organization. And this had some pretty serious consequences. For medieval Christians, dying without confession was terrifying. But priests were dying faster than they could be replaced. In the city of Catania in Sicily, contemporary records describe a crisis so severe that church authorities had to act incredibly quickly just to keep up with the amount of priests dying. Confession, which up to that point had been very carefully regulated, was actually temporarily broadened. Normally, confession was private. It was done one-on-one, but people were dying so fast that special permission was granted so that this absolution could be given under these emergency circumstances to whole groups of people at once. This wasn't revival. This wasn't some theological innovation. This was sheer white-hot survival. People needed to confess. They needed the opportunity, and this was the only way to do it, because people feared not just death, but damnation. And when the church couldn't keep up, panic deepened. Some of these bishops and clergy charged huge fees just to give last rites. It was like holding people's soul hostage. Others just ran away, and so the scandals multiplied. The result was a fracturing of trust. If the church couldn't protect souls in humanity's darkest hour, what did that mean? When the Black Death swept across Europe during this time, it did more than just kill millions of people. It shook the very foundations of the Christian church. It shook the foundations of ritual itself. How do we even continue moving forward as a church during this time where the whole world was changing as far as they could tell? To them, it must have felt like the end of the world. And one of the most intimate and essential practices of all was changing. And that was the act of penance. In medieval Catholic life, penance was most often administered through confession and what was called absolution. People would confess their sins to a priest, and the priest would declare them absolved of their sins, and as far as they were concerned, God had forgiven them. That doesn't necessarily mean it was all theologically correct, but it was a core belief for them. This was a mechanism for confronting sin and reconciling the believer to God and preparing their soul for death. And this all started at what was called the Age of Reason, which was usually about 7 years old. But during the Black Death, the very meaning and practice of penance was completely transformed by this fear, uncertainty, and the sheer scale of death itself. As the plague spread, people increasingly came to see it not just as some mere biological catastrophe, not just some random sickness or such as other famines or plagues that had come before. This was so brutal, it was seen as God's punishment for human sinfulness. And this belief was widespread all over Europe. Chroniclers and clerics alike interpreted this pestilence as divine judgment for the moral corruption of humanity. In response to this, many Christians intensified their practice of penance, hoping that the church's sacrament would stave off death or at least secure God's mercy. The anxiety about the state of their souls skyrocketed, and contemporary testimonies collected in these ecclesiastical records show that a lot of lay people approached confession with an urgent desperation, seeking assurance that their sins were forgiven and that their souls were prepared for the final judgment. In some regions, more than half of those who came forward spoke explicitly about the fear of death and the anxiety for salvation as motives for seeking the sacrament. And this surge in people wanting to confess and be absolved of their sins started to strain the structure of the church itself. There were simply too many people sick, too many people dying, and too few priests to handle it all. So they had to start writing new manuals for how to do ministry. And many confessors' manuals of the period even taught that a healthy level of worry about one's soul was normal amid such an existential crisis. So this meant that priests had to spend much more time simply assuring people that they were forgiven, that Jesus forgave their sins, and that once that they had given their confessions and they had repented of their sins, they were forgiven. This was far beyond what was normal, where someone would come in, confess, feel good about themselves, and continue on with their lives. These were people who knew that they could be dead within 72 hours or less. Their whole families were dying, and they needed this assurance. And this whole crisis also reshaped expressions of penitence in public. As I said earlier, before this, confessions were private, but because they weren't seeing results, people started to take on extreme self-mortification. And this is where the flagellant movement started gaining followers. These were groups that practiced public collective penance. You've seen them in movies probably. These are the people walking down the streets with hoods, and they're whipping themselves on the back and they're hurting themselves. Those are people who believed that they had to destroy their flesh and hurt themselves and suffer to be forgiven of their sins, which we know is completely erroneous, didn't work, but that was what they did in their desperation at the moment. And the church, thankfully, did eventually condemn these movements as something that was at the very least disruptive. In that moment, it was very appealing to people who were desperately searching for some kind of answer, and there simply weren't enough priests to condemn it or stop it, and it just continued on. And sadly, the ripple effect of that continued for quite some time afterward. And so, in that sense, the Black Death completely reshaped the way even penance was looked at. But perhaps most importantly, as traditional penitential practices were overwhelmed with the priests, the church had to adapt to these extraordinary circumstances. Now, for many, faith intensified. For others, it cracked.
Hey, so as I was researching for this video, there's just so much information out there. There was so much that I found that I just simply couldn't fit into this video. I would love to be able to make a 5-hour documentary about this topic, about the Black Plague and how the church responded to it and all the effect that it had on the church and how it had this ripple effect that led up to just 50 years later, John Huss being able to start this movement that led up to the Reformation with Luther and all that. I would love to go into really in-depth detail, but I'm a one-man show and I have a family. I have a son that I homeschool. I have a wife and I have a ministry that I run and I help in our church and all the things that we do in life. And so I literally just don't have the time. Being a one-man show, I'm writing everything, I'm doing all the editing, I'm doing all the recording, I'm doing absolutely everything to put these together, and it takes a tremendous amount of time. And so it just isn't feasible for me to put together a 5-hour, like super long in-depth documentary on these different topics that I do. My hope is that one day I'll be able to hire someone to help me, an editor or something. But in the meantime, what I did was I put together this companion guide that has the story of the video, but a lot of little details that I wasn't able to add in to this video. If you want to go more in depth on this topic, there's a list of different books and resources. There are more facts and details about the Black Plague, some more quotes that I don't get to use in the video, and I talk a little bit more about different things that happened that I can't get into, different people that I can't get into in this particular video. So it is 63 pages long, so it's pretty large, and there's quite a lot in there. So if you're interested in going deeper and you want to support the channel and maybe help me get to the point where I can actually start hiring someone to help me at least edit these things, then you can find a link to that where you can buy the companion guide in the description below. Thank you so much.
These people saw devout Christians die and criminals survive. They prayed and nothing seemed to change. The plague did not discriminate between the faithful and the faithless. So while some people concluded that God was angry, others wondered if he was even there. Others abandoned restraint entirely and just embraced the worldly pleasures in excess and just faced their inevitable death. Like that one verse says, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." One chronicler wrote that many believed no medicine or precaution was of any avail. And so the psychological and spiritual shock of this cannot be overstated. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it destabilized belief itself. How many people do you know who have been faithful to the Lord for their whole life, and then one tragedy happens and they are shaken to their very core and start to question what they believe at all? The church didn't collapse, but it bent under the weight of this catastrophe. The world was dying, and the church was being forced to decide how it would respond. When the plague struck, fear reshaped human behavior almost overnight. Families fled their homes, neighbors avoided one another, entire homes were sealed up and abandoned. But in city after city, parish after parish, the clergy, the men and women of God remained. Not all of them, but many. Priests were bound by duty, belief, and the expectation of the people. They were the ones called when a man was dying. They were the ones expected to stand beside plague victims when everyone else fled. And they paid for it with their lives. The chroniclers across Europe recorded the same grim pattern. Priests entered the infected houses, hearing confessions, administering the last rites, and then getting sick themselves just a few days later. As I said earlier, in many places, half the clergy were dead within a year. Entire monasteries and convents fared no better. Religious houses like these were often densely populated. The meals were communal. These nuns and monks were all living together in close quarters, and when the plague entered a monastery, it would spread with devastating speed. And there were also people coming and going through all of this, and so as they would enter the monastery, coming for help, they would end up getting sick and then taking it back to their families. In England, France, Italy, and the German lands, records describe monasteries left completely or nearly empty. Sometimes some monasteries would only have 1 or 2 survivors. Nuns in particular were often tasked with caring for the sick, and they died in especially high numbers. Some convents never recovered and closed forever. And even as what appeared to be the very fabric of the church collapsing all around them, they took these monasteries, and instead of them just being religious houses, they started to use them as hospitals, then orphanages, and also burial centers. Sometimes they would continue doing this until the very last member fell to the plague. This was not just some institutional heroism. This was true faith in Jesus. They were giving their lives for others. Now, we as Christians understand the heart of this, of giving your life for someone else, but I want to look at this a little bit deeper. For a Christian in the 14th century, the sacraments were not just symbolic gestures. They were believed to be necessary channels of grace. Confession, they believed, cleansed their soul. Whether they were right or not, this is what they believed. Last rites prepared a person for judgment. Even where you were buried mattered. You needed to be buried in consecrated ground. Now imagine thousands dying every day. Priests were overwhelmed. Many would collapse from exhaustion before they ever even contracted the disease itself. In some places, once all of the priests and nuns had died from the disease, people simply started stacking bodies in the monasteries, just hoping that being in a holy place would be enough for God to absolve them of their sins. But I have to say that not every response was admirable or heroic. There were a lot of cowards in the ranks too. A lot of priests ran away. As I mentioned earlier, a lot would start demanding a lot of money. And in an economy that was collapsing under mass death, this was the ultimate betrayal. These scandals spread very quickly, and many people very quickly also started to notice which priests stayed and which priests didn't. One chronicler bitterly remarked that some clergy thought more of their bodies than of souls, and these failures cut deeply. The church's authority rested not only on what they taught, but on moral trust. And once that trust was fractured, the damage would linger long after the plague had passed. Up until this point, the church was seen as infallible, and now, when times were really tough, people were losing trust. And because the plague only lasted for 5 years, they didn't forget. And this set a stage for much bigger movements in the future. And with priests dying faster than replacements could be trained, bishops were faced with a terrible choice. They had to either leave parishes entirely without clergy or ordain men with almost no education or experience. Many places chose to let everyone die to the last man, and others chose to put in incredibly unprepared people. There were men who were barely even literate in Latin that were suddenly responsible for all kinds of souls, which Latin was the only way to read the Bible back then. So these were priests who couldn't even read the Bible themselves. And this decision kept the sacramental system alive, but at a major cost. And in the decades following, there were so many complaints about ignorant, poorly trained clergy that people started to really doubt the church itself. Moral authority weakened, respect declined, and the plague created a generation of priests who didn't even know what they really believed. So a lot of these monasteries that were originally just places of worship, they turned into hospitals, which is why even today there are a lot of hospitals that are named after different saints or different Catholic people, or were founded by Catholics long ago, because the Black Plague was one of the major changes that the Black Plague brought onto the church, is that they started founding and running hospitals and caring for the sick. They may have done it on a smaller scale before, but this turned the Catholic Church, or just the church itself, into a major institution of caring for the sick and dying. And with everything going on, letters and sermons from that time, they reveal all kinds of exhaustion, confusion, doubt, even among the most devout men who never did abandon their belief. Once the worst wave of the plague finally subsided, the church was still standing. But it was not the same church. But despite all of this happening, at the very top of the ranks of the church at that time, there was one man who faced the plague without fleeing, and that was a pope. By the time the plague reached southern France, the spiritual center of Western Christianity was no longer Rome. It was Avignon, and it was here that Pope Clement VI presided over a church facing the greatest catastrophe in its history. But unlike many other rulers, Clement did not flee. As the plague tore through Avignon, killing the clergy, the servants, and the citizens by the thousands, the Pope remained inside the city, surrounded by death, fear, and desperate prayer. This decision alone would shape how history remembered him and much of the church itself. His personal doctor was Guy le Chaliac, one of the most respected surgeons of the Middle Ages, and who was also an eyewitness and a writer about the plague. Chauliac described two forms of the disease sweeping through Avignon, one that attacked the lungs and killed within days, and another that was marked specifically by swelling and a much longer and more painful suffering. In his medical writings, he said, "This epidemic was so virulent that scarcely 1 in 4 escaped." They believed that fire would purify the air, so the Pope slept with 2 fires in apartments next to him to purify the air. And access to the Pope was also restricted. Clergy rotated in and out and had very limited contact with him face to face. One of the greatest fears during the plague, as we've talked about, was dying without proper burial or last rites. In response to this, Clement issued declarations assuring believers that those who died of the plague with sincere repentance would receive forgiveness even if they didn't receive the normal rituals. This was a completely mind-blowing thing to be taught in those days. The idea that somebody could be forgiven by God without a priest giving those rites had not been heard of before. The Pope also authorized the blessing of the Rhone River so that bodies could be disposed of respectfully once the cemeteries overflowed. These were grim decisions that he had to make under unimaginable pressure. Now, we talked about the flagellant people earlier, the ones who would whip themselves and hurt themselves, believing that by suffering, God would forgive them, and this movement was really spreading. Well, Pope Clement VI, he actually condemned this movement, and he ordered bishops to suppress it. He told lay people that participation in this was forbidden. Why? Because the church was recognizing something crucial. This took some time, but they finally got it. Uncontrolled religious fervor, fueled by fear, actually fractured society, and it undermined the church itself. This wasn't a rejection of penance or repentance, as some people claimed at that time. It was simply trying to rein things back in to what they believed was the biblical way of doing things. And then another horrible thing happened while the Black Plague was raging across Europe, and that was rumors began to spread. Because when people don't know who to blame or they don't know the cause, they will find someone. And so there were accusations that took place. People started saying it wasn't a plague, it wasn't an accident, it was murder. And this accusation of murder was simple, terrifying, and wrong. They claimed that the Jews had poisoned the wells. Now, there's no single origin point for this rumor that can be identified, but historians trace its rapid spread to the Rhine Valley in 1348, where the plague arrived early and violently. Under torture, several Jews were forced to confess to well poisoning. Confessions that were then circulated from town to town as proof that they were the ones killing everyone. One such confession, which was extracted in Chillon, which is near Lake Geneva, it described a vast conspiracy involving Jewish communities across Europe, coordinated to destroy Christians using poison. This was just a fantasy. These were just innocent people trying to live their lives, but someone wanted to blame somebody, and it was written down, copied, preached, and believed. What followed was not spontaneous rage. It was organized, deliberate, and devastating. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, before the plague had even reached that city, local authorities arrested the entire Jewish population. And after a brief political struggle, the city council turned against them. And on February 14th, approximately 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a wooden platform in the city cemetery. Their crime was not poisoning wells. It was just being convenient targets. In Basel, the Jewish community was rounded up and burned inside a specially constructed wooden building. Children were spared only to be forcibly baptized or expelled. In Mainz, once home to one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, mobs slaughtered thousands. Chroniclers described Jews as barricading themselves in their homes and choosing suicide over forced conversion. In Cologne, Worms, Speyer, Frankfurt, and dozens of smaller towns, Jewish communities were destroyed or expelled entirely. centuries-old settlements vanished in weeks. This violence did not happen in a vacuum. In many cases, city councils sanctioned these executions, local clergy simply failed to intervene, and debts owed to Jewish moneylenders were conveniently erased. The plague created an opportunity for fear, for greed, and for vengeance cloaked in righteousness. While some bishops and priests tried to protect the Jewish communities, others simply remained silent, and there were a few that actively encouraged the accusations. Unfortunately, the church was not united. They were not a single voice on the ground. And where authority is fractured, mobs ruled. But thankfully, from Avignon, Pope Clement issued a clear condemnation of this. In the papal bulls of 1348, Clement declared that the accusations against the Jews were false. He pointed out that the Jews were dying of the plague too, often in places with zero contact with Christians. He warned that those who were attacking the Jews were being deceived by the devil. In Avignon itself, Jews were placed under papal protection. But papal words back then traveled slowly, and fear traveled fast. By the time official condemnation arrived, entire communities were already in ashes. The authority of the church, strong in theory, proved weak against the terror on the streets. And these accusations didn't arise randomly. European Jews had long lived as religious outsiders. They were protected at times, tolerated at others, and often resented. They were visibly distinct, they looked different, they were legally segregated, and they were associated with money lending due to Christian prohibitions. In moments of stability, these tensions would simmer, but in the moments of catastrophe, they exploded. By the time the first wave of the Black Death ended, hundreds of Jewish communities had been destroyed. Survivors fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, reshaping the entire demographic map of where the Jews were in Europe for centuries to come. What was lost cannot be measured only in numbers. Languages, traditions, libraries, songs, and memories vanished, often with zero record. This is one of the moments when the church's moral authority was most severely tested, and in many places, it failed. By the early 1350s, the first wave of the plague had begun to subside. Europe was scarred forever. The church had prayed, buried, comforted, condemned, adapted, and failed. It had shown compassion and cowardice. Authority remained, but it was no longer unquestioned. People had seen too much. They had watched some priests die heroically and others flee. They had heard sermons of judgment and seen innocents perish. The plague certainly had not destroyed Christianity, but it did change how people related to it forever. But the plague didn't just produce chaos and violent people, as we've said. There were true people of God alive and well during the plague. Just to name two, there were John Welch, who I'll be doing a video on later, and the other was Saint Roche. According to late medieval tradition, Roche was born into a wealthy family in Montpellier in southern France. Renouncing his inheritance, he became a pilgrim traveling from town to town, caring for the sick, and giving whatever he had to the poor. One of these journeys led him to the plague-stricken Italy, and Roche began tending victims of the disease. He didn't avoid them, he prayed with them, he comforted them, he stayed with them. Eventually, Roche himself fell ill. There was a swelling that appeared on his body, and a sign that to medieval eyes marked him as a condemned man. Believing he would die, Roche withdrew from society, isolating himself in a forest to avoid infecting others. Alone, feverish, and weak, he waited for death. But death did not come. According to church tradition, a dog belonging to a nearby nobleman began bringing Roche bread each day, sustaining him while he recovered. His wounds healed, his strength returned, and Roche survived the plague. In this world where survival often seemed so random, this story carried enormous weight. Here was a man who had faced the plague directly, not as a ruler and not as a physician, but as a servant, and lived. The word of this spread, and after his death, people started praying to Roche for protection from the plague. He became known as the Plague Saint. There were shrines dedicated to him, multiplying across France, Italy, Germany, and beyond, and miracle accounts associated with his intercession began to appear. There were records of sick people recovering, households spared, and places where the entire epidemic was lessened or even potentially stopped, where people prayed in his name, or he prayed. Now, I'm not saying I believe in this stuff. I don't believe in praying to saints, but this is part of the whole story of how the church was affected during the Black Plague. But to medieval Christians, Roche mattered not because he avoided suffering, but because he endured it and continued to serve. It wasn't that he was untouched by the plague, he bore its marks, he survived it. And in doing so, he became a symbol of hope in a dying world. And it also showed that he didn't just live by faith, he also brought in the practical side of actually caring for the sick. So as we come to the final part of this story, we ask what happened next. How did the church adapt to a world permanently altered by mass death? Now, as we've seen so many different ways that the church was changed by all of this, there are some other things that took place. As the plague started to fade away after 5 years of facing brutal, horrible deaths, the images of crucifixion became more graphic. Saints were depicted closer to human suffering. Death was no longer distant, it was an intimate part of the church itself. The plague reshaped how people imagined God. They didn't just see him as a judge, but they saw him as one who suffered alongside humanity. One of the church's most lasting responses was that they became more practical. After the plague, hospitals expanded. Organized charity and showing of love became more systematic. It wasn't just one random good-hearted monk going there back and forth showing love to people. Entire institutions were created to care for the sick and house the poor and bury the dead. There was much more organization in all of this. In many cities, church-run hospitals became permanent fixtures. They weren't just emergency measures. The plague taught them a hard lesson. Suffering would return, and the church needed structures in place to be prepared for it, not just sermons. Now, we've only talked about the first wave of the Black Plague in this video, and there were other waves, and the church responded differently in the later waves. Over time, communities were more prepared. In cities like Ragusa, which is modern Dubrovnik, they instituted mandatory isolation periods for all arriving ships and travelers. The concept of quarantine came directly out of the Black Plague itself. People originally saw disease as just judgment of God, but as they started to learn more, and they were still far from modern understanding, but they started to realize that disease was not just a judgment of God, there were practical things involved as well. Historians often note as well that while the Reformation was still a couple centuries away, the plague had quietly loosened the church's grip on unquestioned obedience. And once authority cracks, it never quite seals. By the end of the first wave of the Black Plague, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population had been wiped out. An estimated 20 to 25 million people were gone in just 5 years. The church had adapted slowly, imperfectly, and painfully, but it had adapted. And in doing so, it began shaping the modern world's uneasy balance between belief, responsibility, and care for others. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and watch my video where I tell 3 stories about Christian martyrs that I think will change your life. See you in the next video.